Hi, my name is Stephen Daniels, and I'm here today to talk about the Silk Roads that connected China and the Western world. I had always thought it was just that a couple of roads over crazy tall mountains that connected two continents to trade some rare products the other lacked. But it and its connections were way greater than that. The term Silk Roads, for one thing, is a relatively new word. German geologist Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen came up with it in the 19th century to describe the trade and communications network. But throughout most of history, nobody called it this. And the truth is, doing this project, I've realized that I've held common misconceptions about the Silk Roads. Like that Marco Polo's journey was a documented exploration for the sake of exploring unknown places? Nope. Marco Polo didn't even write anything. The Travels of Marco Polo, the book, was a second-hand account written by his friend, Rusticello de Pisa. Though fairly accurate, or at least considered fairly accurate, a romance novelist wrote it to romanticize exotic and faraway places. Another misconception is that these roads were established and maintained by the Chinese for trade. And maybe the Chinese were among the first to use the high mountain passes for trade, but trade itself on the Silk Roads happened steadily for over 1600 years between 130 BCE and 1453 CE. And covering over 4,000 miles, it reached well outside of China's domain. You simply can't ask a question like, what did China, Rome, or India do on the Silk Roads? It's just too broad of a question to answer. They did different things over hundreds of years. So it's important to understand exactly what specific time period you're talking about when referencing the Silk Roads. Many people of different races and cultures traded on these roads for well over 1,000 years. Sometimes the Chinese and silk were involved. Sometimes they were not. And there was always much more to trade than just silk. Sometimes good things like fruits and spices, but at other times, disease and invasive species were the unintentional and unseen result of the international trade. The fact is, there were multiple pros and cons about the Silk Roads, and it has a complicated history. It just isn't as simple as roads for trading silk. And as for that history, the Silk Roads go all the way back to a man named Zhang Qian who worked for the Han Dynasty in China around 138 BCE. Because of the efforts in building the Great Wall, war led him into exploration of the unknown West via an intelligence operation. He was captured, imprisoned for a decade, but eventually returned with detailed reports of unknown Western states. He eventually found some horses and is credited with introducing them into China. The Great Wall itself could have had much to do with the early stability of the roads, or at least in the Far East. Without it, China might not have stayed stable enough after the inevitable changing of heads of government. Hundreds of years and a few Chinese dynasties later, China does become very stable under the Tang dynasty. Starting around 618, there was what was considered a bit of a golden age for China, where roads were safer and culture and art was flourishing. Silk flowed out of China to the Western world. But by 906, it was all over when the Tang dynasty came to its end. Now, the roads became fairly unstable for the next 200 years until the rise of the Mongol Empire in 1206. A man named Temujin was crowned Genghis Khan that year. Khan was a ruthless leader that conquered a huge amount of territory about the size of Africa, but he was also known to have outlawed torture and allowed people to keep whatever religion they liked. He supposedly had Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists among his followers. This is a time period when the Silk Roads reached very far and were considered stable and safe because Genghis Khan protected and promoted trade. But nothing lasts forever. He eventually died in 1227, and his empire with him about 100 years later. A few decades after his death is when Marco Polo enters the story. Polo left for the Far East in 1271 and was gone for 24 years. It is a debated topic among historians if Polo actually made it to China or just the Mongol Empire. Apparently, the book leaves out some hard to miss features, like the Great Wall, for example, but is otherwise thought to be fairly accurate. One on the trail, on the tail end of the history comes the rise of the Ottoman Empire. In 1326, it eventually controlled much of Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Asia. At this time, new boat technology and trade routes opened up and strangled the profitability of the already hard to travel mountain passes. A new Silk Route overseas was born. Meanwhile, disease reached the far west, killing off about a third of Europe. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, hit there in 1351. And if that wasn't the last nail in the coffin for the Silk Roads, or at least in the western part, the new Ming and Qing dynasties in China became quite xenophobic and put the country on lockdown in 1368, lasting for hundreds of years. The Silk Roads are considered abandoned by 1453 when the Ottoman Empire blocked its main routes. As for what was traded, of course, silk was traded. The strong and beautiful fabric must have seemed incredible to the Western world of cotton, wool, and haircloth fashions, but much more was traded. From the East came tea, dyes, precious stones, porcelain vases and plates, spices, metal artifacts, medicine, ivory, rice, paper, gunpowder, and the rest of the Western world had plenty that the Far East wanted, like horses, saddles and riding tack, grapes, dogs and other animals, animal furs and skins, honey, fruits, glassware, woolen blankets, rugs, carpets, textiles, gold, silver, slaves, weapons and armor. The list goes on to include all sorts of knowledge and technologies. For example, artistic influence and religious philosophies both came over the mountains. Sometime around 400 CE, the Chinese monk Faxin went to India seeking copies of Buddhist books. Via the Silk Roads, the idea of Buddhism reached northern China, and the Nestorian church found their way there, fleeing Roman persecution from the west. Some of the earliest depictions of Buddha are found in northwestern China in the form of ancient cave sculptures, and the Nestorian church is also still alive and well. But the one thing that came out of the Silk Roads that is my personal favorite has got to be the apple. That is, the modern fruit we all know and love. From a joint partnership between the United States and China, genetic researchers have been sequencing the genome from apples from all over the world, both domesticated and wild crab apples, to find out where exactly they came from. It turns out that almost half of all domesticated apple species came out of crossbreeding of native Kazakhstan apples along the Silk Roads. Kazakhstan apple seeds planted or spit out along the roots crossbred with other native crab apples, creating many different species. To the east, apples got sweeter. To the west, they got bigger and softer. Eventually, some of the better types were brought to North America where they hybridized again, creating our modern types of apples. But their genetic footprint follows the Silk Road perfectly, connecting wild apples from China all the way to France. This research could be key in developing higher yielding, bigger, and disease and pest resistant apples. Unfortunately for many people in the 1300s, the apple wasn't the only species to get a leg up because of the Silk Roads. The bubonic plague also got many chances to mutate and hybridize. This disease found a way to jump species from rats to ticks to humans because of the constant trade of animals and animal furs. The bacterial disease managed to kill off around a third of Europe, maybe more, and was the worst pandemic in recorded history. But it wasn't alone. Smallpox, anthrax, leprosy, and many other diseases crossed the Silk Roads too. The trade network always had the side effect of creating rest stops along the way. Civilizations sprang up to support the economy of trading along these routes, and epidemiologists have found a plethora of valuable information in their ancient latrines. In one 2,000-year-old sample of feces and hygiene sticks, they have found eggs from 4 species of parasitic worms, including roundworm, whipworm, tapeworm, and Chinese liver fluke. The liver fluke parasite is of particular interest because it was found in Zhangjiang, which is an arid basin in northwest China. The parasite needs a swampy environment to complete its life cycle, but it was found over 1,000 miles away from the closest swamp. This is tangible proof that disease was being traded along the Silk Roads. Genealogical disease research has also led to the Silk Roads. It has only recently been discovered that Behçet's disease primarily affects those with genetic ties to the Silk Roads. When research on the disease broadened to focus on all countries off the Silk Road, it helped yield new treatment methods for not only Behçet's disease, but other genetic diseases as well. As you can tell, the subject of the Silk Roads goes way beyond silk cloth or even the trade network it created. Silk might have been among the more valuable things traded on the Silk Road at the time. It was enough to give it its name. But in modern times, it is still helping to unlock scientific mysteries that are a medical benefit to all of humankind, which is much more valuable, at least to us in the now. Furthermore, we are yet to find out how many other fruits, vegetables, or flowers, like the apple, owe a similar debt to the trade routes. And the complex histories of the Silk Roads, well, they're in no danger of becoming less complex. In one of the largest planned projects in modern history, $900 billion large, China broke ground this year to connect 65 countries with trains through the old trade routes all the way to Africa. I fully expect that the history of the Silk Roads is not finished and that a new chapter will eventually need to be added. But for now, it has given us a lot of valuable information to go with.